Another episode of Film Streak. You know what we do here. We watch movies, talk about movies. Sometimes they're new, sometimes they're old. Let's just get right to this because this is a lot. We're doing an episode here for Halloween, for October. This is that time of year. Things get weird, things get freaky. And what better of a film franchise than Hellraiser? This is a franchise that, the first film came out in 1987. And I think for a lot of people, this was probably an introduction not only to Clive Barker and his style of horror and his style of storytelling, but also just this. Look, this is one of the franchises that basically created a new villain, right? One of the more interesting, I don't know if I want to say one of the better, but one of the more interesting horror film franchise villains in cinema history. And the reason I say maybe not one of the best ones is because this franchise, as I walk through all of these films, it is such a roller coaster. I can remember seeing the first film in 1987. I didn't see it in the theaters. I was too young to see this, but I saw it probably a few years later, and I probably saw it on TV, like one of those late night movies. So it was heavily edited. I didn't really even understand what this movie was about. I think the first one that I actually saw, probably like on VHS, was Hellraiser II. And these two films as a pair, I think they really work pretty good together. I feel like there's a little bit of overlap. I mean, the second film kind of recaps the first film in a way. And it's almost like you don't really need the first film, but I think you kind of do because you need to see like the beginnings of this. And as I look at all the other films in the franchise, look, let me just do this. Normally I would go film by film, tell you what they're about and what's good about them or what's interesting at least. This is such a strange franchise. There are, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, supposedly 11 films in this franchise. And that is at least twice as many as I thought there were. I remember seeing the first two, and I was pretty young at the time. So I kind of had a different handle on what these films were doing and what they were trying to say. I thought it was all about this idea of these characters, the Cenobites and Pinhead, probably worst villain name of all time, I think. Because Pinhead to me is always like an idiot. This guy is no Pinhead, this character, this being. This is a sort of a maestro from hell who knows everything, who can delight in the pleasures of pain and torture and basically all of the weirdest and craziest things and sensations that a person could experience. That's kind of the gist. This character of Pinhead is so iconic that it's on the poster of the first, basically on the poster of every film. And I think that is what kind of leads this franchise astray in a weird way. There's something about the sort of mythical approach, the fantastical approach to these characters and this world. And yet these films, as they go on, they just become really derivative and kind of unoriginal and in some places kind of boring. Because there's a lot of territory here that I think either sexual or psychological or just the body horror elements of this that you only get like notions of. And it doesn't really go full throttle with these ideas. Now, I think the first two films, for their time, for the late 80s, I think they were there. But as these films kind of went on, and you get into Hellraiser III, which is 92, and then you've got the introduction of the Cenobites to the masses, right? To the world. And I think that's the mistake that this franchise makes. Because not only do you have a reporter, someone who is really kind of outside of this whole situation versus the first two films, which are basically Kirsty and her stepmother and the father. And it's kind of like it all takes place almost like in this one house, and this sort of portal to hell that this puzzle box opens up, right? And so you kind of have it's actually a very small type of story. But when you get to Hellraiser 3 and even some of the other films where you start involving like police and law enforcement, because you've got detectives that are tracking down murders or serial killers or what they think is a serial killer, and turns out it's actually Pinhead and this puzzle box that are all involved, you know, it sort of takes away the fantasy element of it. It tries to ground it in some sort of reality, but I think you lose the magic. And I think that's a big part of why the story in the first two films works, because it almost feels otherworldly. It really does feel like this is detached from reality, and that's necessary to kind of go along with this idea, right? When you get that glimpse of what, like the underworld and Leviathan and all of that in Hellraiser 2, it's like, whoa, I've never seen anything like this before. This is like some other imaginative sort of representation of hell. And yet we get other sort of glimpses of it over some of these films, but there's something that I read about this franchise. And I think it might have been, it's in one of the later films where a lot of these sequels were actually spec scripts that were written not even involving Hellraiser or Pinhead or any of the pieces of this franchise. They were just written as scripts, as horror movies. And they were kind of shaped or shoehorned into this franchise. Like when you watch them all in a row, you see the inconsistency. You see the sort of stylistic choices and the story choices that don't really line up. And, you know, I could go Hellraiser 3, Hellraiser 4, which is actually an interesting entry, I got to say, because it does take us into the future and it takes us into the past of who created the puzzle box and why and how has that sort of ancestry, the bloodline of it all, passed throughout the years. And it's an interesting way to approach this story because we kind of ran out of steam with Pinhead and all this in present day. So let's look at where it came from and where it might end up, right? I kind of like that. I appreciate the approach. I think the problem with it is the film just feels really slapped together. Like it doesn't feel complete in a way. It expands some of the mythology a little bit. You learn a little more of the, I guess, even the terminology, like of the configurations and that kind of thing, and who is who in the history of it all. But there's something that it doesn't really have a drive to it. I don't really feel like it's pushing anything forward. It's more explaining, giving us context. And that's something that you could have probably wrapped that into another film that had a little more forward momentum in terms of just the plot. One interesting thing with Hellraiser 4 is this is like one of the, I guess this is maybe the first or very early film of Adam Scott, you know, from Parks and Rec. And so it was really weird to see him in this film. But, you know, that's the thing with horror film franchises is you might see someone doing some of their early work and they go on to do bigger work and they become celebrities or stars in their own right. You know, they take on much bigger projects down the road. So it's interesting to kind of trace back to like, where did they maybe get a start, you know? So like seeing Adam Scott here was interesting. He's kind of a villain, I think. And it's just a weird, it just hits weird seeing what Adam Scott has done with comedy and all that in the years since. But it's an interesting entry into the franchise. I don't really know that it holds together so well, but Hellraiser 5, it's from director Scott Derrickson, who, from what I can see in this franchise, this feels the most like some new sort of blood, some new kind of creative visual style that isn't in the earlier films. Because those earlier, let's see, the first 4 films, they do feel like films from the 80s and 90s. And when we get to Hellraiser V Inferno, this is from 2000, it does feel like a newer era of filmmaking. The stylistic choices, the sort of editing, the music, the cinematography of it, it does feel more modern. Now, at this point, it is over 20 years old, so it has aged in its own way. But when you think about, like, well, Scott Derrickson has gone on to do other interesting work, sort of in the horror genre, whether it's something like, what did he do? He did the movie with Ethan Hawke, with the family and like the haunted house or whatever. Sinister, I think it was. And then he even did a Doctor Strange. He did a Marvel movie, right? So there's talent there. And I feel like you can see traces of it in Hellraiser 5. Hellraiser 6, you know, again, this is another spec script. It feels like it's written as something else. The only connection that I think we really get is Ashley Lawrence comes back as Kirsty. And she's in the beginning of the film, and for a moment, it seems like, oh, that's all we get. We just see her at the beginning, some things happen, and like, oh, okay, that was our kind of stunt cameo for the film. We're not really connected to the rest of the franchise. The plot does have some kind of fun sort of twists to it and turns, because it is a film that is about a man who is, I don't know, having visions, and they're coming from the puzzle box. And so now we start to lean into the whole Hellraiser aspect of it. But there is kind of a big thing at the end where it's like, wait, why has this been happening? And how is he experiencing this? And maybe without giving it away too much, turns out that there's some other factor at play here, and it does involve Kirsty, right? The character from the original film. And I thought that was an interesting way to tie it into the franchise. You can feel like the skeleton of it isn't a Hellraiser movie, but there's enough there that, you know, this whole franchise is that. It is experiment after experiment in trying to connect threads to, I guess, the main sort of mythology or the characters of the first film. Even the next film, Hellraiser Hellworld from 2005, this one, it really involves nothing with any of the other films except the house. This all takes place in a house. This is about a young woman and her gamer friends. And turns out there's this house where there's gamer culture. They're having some kind of event. This is where it feels like real, like early 2000s. Like there's a lot here that just, it almost feels like this should have been like one of those, like I Saw What You Did Last Summer or whatever the hell they're called. Actually, by the end of it, it even starts to look like a Saw knockoff, just in the way that it sort of recaps what we saw and what we think happened, and then what actually has been happening throughout the film. Trying to do that whole pull the rug out from under you kind of thing. Even the casting here is sort of all over the place. You know, we have Lance Henriksen, who, for my money, was having a nice run, because I remember he was on that show Millennium, and that was a really interesting show. It was dark, it was strange, it was kind of in that like X-Files territory. And then you've got a young Henry Cavill, of all people, shows up in this film. I mean, he's probably like 20 something years old. So at first it's like, wait, is that Superman? What? But he's in this. He's not the main character, but you've got different sorts of skill levels with some of the acting here. And some of it works, some of it really doesn't. I think a lot of it has to do with the whole premise. You know, this whole people trapped in a haunted house, and this person goes down a hall and things happen to them. This person goes into a different room and things happen to them. It does feel like things we've seen done better in other films and in other franchises. And strangely enough, you know, you get to another film in this franchise, Hellraiser Deader, also from 2005, and also apparently written as a spec script, not really involving Hellraiser at all. And you can see that it is about an entirely different thing. It's about another reporter, and she's investigating a cult of these people called Deaders, who are somehow killing people but bringing them back to life. It's honestly kind of fuzzy to me, like what exactly the hell is happening in this, but the puzzle box shows up and Pinhead shows up, and now it starts to turn into this other thing. It's a little bit, you can see it, it's trying to explore like the idea of dealing with trauma, dealing with reliving a certain time in your life, maybe as a child. And I think those are the themes that it's trying to like dance with, but it just feels real shoehorned in. And even the whole Hellraiser connection, it's so thin. It's such a small like trace of what this franchise is. Honestly, it kind of feels like a fan film. And I think it's got a couple of interesting moments in it and some ideas I think it's trying to play with, but it's really not a great entry into this franchise. But I got to say, if there were anything that tops it, it's the next two films, Hellraiser Revelations and Hellraiser Judgment. This is from 2011, 2018. And from what I've seen, it's like these are films that were basically meant to just kind of keep control of the property for the studio or for the producers or whatever. It's like if we don't make a film within a certain amount of years, well, this gets turned over and we lose the rights to it. So we won't be able to kind of keep, cashing in on this thing. And these two films, from 2005 to 2011, that's 6 years. From 2011 to 2018, another several years pass. And it does feel like they're just throwing stuff against the wall. Hellraiser Revelations, it's such a thin connection. It's even thinner than any of the other sequels. I mean, at least the other ones feel more like they're sort of related in some way, but these, I feel like they really are kind of hitting the bottom of the barrel at this point. And it's not even the performances necessarily. I think it's just more like there really isn't like a deep connection to any of the material. And it feels very empty. The one thing I'll give Hellraiser Judgment, and this is kind of a shallow observation, I guess, but it is, for all of these films, for some of the kind of goriness of them and the sort of graphic things that are shown and on display, Hellraiser Judgment is actually kind of brutal. Like, not just like bloody, but like violent and like punishing. And that's the one thing I took away from it. Otherwise, it's like three detectives investigating a serial killer, and turns out, it's actually something to do with the puzzle box and Pinhead and all that. And they're dealing with their own sort of demons, and how do they reconcile that with Pinhead and his crew, right? And by the time we get to the Hellraiser from 2022, which honestly kind of seems like a reboot, even though it feels like a sequel. If you read the description on Hulu, this is a Hulu exclusive, I think. It says something about like this is a reimagining of the classic horror franchise or whatever the language is. And yet it doesn't entirely reimagine anything. You still got the same puzzle box. You still got the same sort of Cenobites and their mission to recruit new souls to hell. The only difference is Pinhead is not a man or male. Pinhead is more female, or maybe androgynous in some way. So I think the idea of this being a reboot, I guess, if you want to call it that. The more interesting thing is that the character, at least the main character, the young woman in the film, her struggle, her kind of introduction to the puzzle box and all of this, her visions that she starts having, it is at least a more interesting approach to drawing the metaphor between addiction and maybe grief and the sort of struggle, the suffering that she's had. And I gotta say, at least that's an attempt to do something a little different, maybe something a little more thoughtful and more pointed versus just, more murders are happening and we got to figure out who's doing it. This feels a little more personal. It feels a little more like back to the original, a little more intimate. It certainly looks more modern, it looks more contemporary, but I think there's something about the original film, or the first two films, that they're kind of stuck in time in a way. And I think that's what makes them work. It just has a real tactile kind of strange nature to it. So with those original films, I think the main thing that was the draw to me when they first came out was that these are so strange, so weird, but also so interesting, like intriguing, Because like, what is this? And if you watch them as a young person or as a child, or not a child, but maybe a teenager, I hope there's no children watching these movies, you might think, well, wait a minute, this is about just like evil things, But the first film itself even goes to that place. It tries to tell that story of Uncle Frank, who was into some really weird things and kind of got caught up in it. Things went too far. And now he's like summoned demons from below. And so this is a kind of a way for Clive Barker or just the filmmakers in this franchise to explore some of that stuff. So anyway, this was an interesting franchise. I've only watched the first two films that I could remember. I had enough in my memory from those first two. The third one, I feel like I must have seen it at some point because some of it seemed kind of corny, even in the moment, even in 1992 or whatever it was. But it was like, oh, okay, they're taking Hellraiser to the next level, But looking back on it now, it's not that great of an entry. And I feel like it takes the whole thing in the wrong direction. Like, I think this is the type of story, this is like the sort of subject matter that it has to stay behind the closed doors of some weird old haunted house. And it has to live deep in the minds of some troubled people. And speaking of which, it's like, I know this was originally a Clive Barker sort of property and characters and story, but I wonder about that. Like I've had an interesting sort of understanding of Clive Barker and his work, and I can't say I entirely understand it, but I know that one of the first books that I read, one of the first novels, horror novels, that really kind of, I don't know, expanded some of my ideas of what is possible and what makes interesting storytelling is a book of his called Imagica. I don't know if you ever read that? You ever seen that? It's a giant book, and I think in later editions they broke it into either 2 parts or 3 parts. I can't remember. But it's a really interesting story. And it involves different like dominions, basically like different realms, and Earth and the world that we know is just one of those realms. And one of the main characters is a sort of I don't know if I don't even remember the terminology in the book, but I guess it's almost sort of like a what the character's name was Pi, and it was, in some instances or in some moments in the story, Pi was a man or Pi was a woman. And it was really kind of mind-bending, at least for me at the time, because I might have been like, I don't know, 15 years old when I read that book or something. But it was a really interesting way to not only tell this story spanning different sort of universes or versions of our world, but also characters that changed from chapter to chapter sometimes. That's my memory of it. I could all be remembering it all kind of wrong now, but because that might have been, 30 years ago when I read that book. But I do remember it being a really interesting and massive work, and the story itself, and thinking, what kind of mind comes up with something like this? I mean, it's so imaginative and so kind of monumental in its scope and in what it's trying to say and what's happening in it. And it's a book that I really admire. And at some point, I feel like I will have to go back and reread it and maybe see it all with brand new eyes. And yeah, maybe it's not that good. I don't know. But at the time, when it landed for me, it was like, this is really different. And Clive Barker, I'm down with whatever you're doing. And Hellraiser was before that. And, I have a fond memory of one of my friends, a late friend of mine who I grew up with and went to school with and everything. One of his favorite films was Nightbreed. It was another Clive Barker film. I think it was before Hellraiser. And, there was a part of me that kind of understood the fascination with it. It's this kind of interesting group or sort of a bunch of creatures or demons or, I kind of don't remember. I probably should see that again at some point, just revisit it and maybe understand it better. But I do remember it being very kind of imaginative and out there and just so different. Like there was no other film like it at the time. And to know that that was one of his favorite films, and to me, like, it always kind of held a spot of like, Clive Barker's doing something different. Now, I haven't read any of his other books since that time, since like, I don't know, the early 90s or mid 90s. And I think he's been involved with other films or TV projects, but I haven't kept up with that. So a lot of it kind of ended with Hellraiser for me. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I feel like there's probably been other stuff that I've missed the boat on. So that might be something to add to the list and check out someday. But it is curious that this franchise, at some point, it even got away from Clive Barker, right? Like, this is based on his characters and everything from the first films, but at some point he kind of, from what I've seen, kind of disavowed all of this. Like, I'm not involved with this shit. Because it does get way off track. And I really do think it loses a lot of what was built into the early film. The early few films, let's say. Even the last one here, the remake/sequel, I think it kind of gets back to that territory a little bit, but I don't really know if Clive Barker had anything to do with it. I feel like he's probably moved on. I mean, with how this thing has gone over the years, I would understand that. So it's been an interesting little trip down memory lane, but also discovering some of these things for the first time and seeing all the inconsistencies, seeing all the ups and downs. And you could look at other film franchises, probably see a similar thing. I think the only one that has probably stayed the course, even though it's still kind of diminishing returns, is probably the Saw franchise. But I think that's because you pretty much had the same sort of creative people behind the scenes. And I think at some point it just got boring. It just got repetitive. But the standard of quality, I felt like, was kind of there, for better or worse. But this franchise, it really is kind of everywhere. And I think if you really want to find the gold in this, I would say the first two films and maybe parts of Bloodline would help understand, because it does give you more context. And then Hellraiser V, Inferno, I think it's at least showing us how this could progress into more contemporary styles of film. Other than that, I mean, the last one, I just don't know where to put it. I just don't know. Is it a sequel? Is it a remake? Is it both somehow? And for that reason, it's just more frustrating than it is interesting. But for me, it would be 1, 2, 4, and 5. And after that, I feel like you're probably okay with skipping a lot of the others. There really isn't a lot that really connects them and truly ties them to the entire franchise or the core of the franchise. So take it for what you will. Check some of these out if you like. If you've ever been curious about this franchise, and maybe this is a place to start. But if you're a fan of this, Tell me, man, what am I missing? I mean, what is it about the character or about this sort of subject matter, or what is it that I'm just not seeing, maybe? I mean, I'm curious, because this is a lot of films for half an idea, you know? Anyway, that's it for me for this episode. I'll check you out next time. Go to filmstreak.com, get more episodes. You can sign up there, check out the list. And until then, go watch something new.